A man starts up his prototype arcade panel. Trying his first game, he notices the directions aren't exactly right. He is lost. He is dead. It is game over.
Don't let this happen to you.
I'm Eric R. Christoph of Christoph.io. Today, we'll be discussing controller mapping for your arcade cabinet along with MAME defaults. To better understand the details coming, let's cover some basics. When you're building an arcade cabinet, you'll most likely need to wire up those joysticks and buttons to something. Typically, this is a USB board called a keyboard encoder. Also known as an arcade controller, the board has rows of pins that you connect the switches on your joysticks or buttons to. What does the board actually do? Well, it's called a keyboard encoder for a reason. As we generally use PCs to build our retro arcade cabinets, and keyboards have a lot of keys on them, it makes sense that we'd use a device which translates the pressing of switches in your joysticks and buttons into keystrokes that your emulator is expecting. That's where the keyboard encoder comes into play. Your system typically sees it as just another keyboard, but instead of typing with a keyboard, you're typing with your joystick and buttons. Now, there are some controllers out there that act like actual gamepads, and they're recognized as such in Windows and Linux, like the Zinmo and Lono boards pictured on top. Others, like Ultimarc's PAC series, are purely keyboard encoders, with analog support showing up as mice, while your joysticks and buttons show up as key presses. While there are quite a few to choose from, essentially the job of the arcade controller is to take your button and joystick input actions, but output key presses or gamepad commands to your PC instead. Some keyboard encoders are more advanced and let you reprogram which pin represents which key press, while some are more hardwired with default keys to each pin. I personally like the ones that can be reprogrammed because I may or may not be a control freak. For my pedestal prototype, I'm utilizing the Ultimarc MiniPAC controllers, but I also built my father's TARDIS-themed bar top arcade cabinet using the Zinmo and RetroPie. This video deals more with a keyboard encoder than a joystick controller, but some content may still apply. While you could go and buy a controller online, some choose to go directly to the source and hack an old USB keyboard and perform some creative wiring of their own. To me, this would be an interesting side project, but I'll personally stick with a dedicated controller board, primarily because I'd rather have a dedicated device towards this function and not have to worry about ghosting. Ghosting is a side effect of how keyboards generally work, and it happens when you press certain keys at the same time, and an additional and unintentional key press is registered. That's the ghost. You don't see this while you type on a keyboard normally because we're not often holding down a lot of multiple keys. However, imagine an arcade panel where multiple players are hitting a lot of keys simultaneously, and you could see where this collision could occur. Even some dedicated encoders can have this issue, so make sure the one you purchase details the lack of ghosting specifically, or build your own ghost-safe matrix mapping yourself. Key presses are great and all, but we're not here to play the arcade version of Mavis Beacon Teaches Typing. We're here to play video games. So say you buy a controller and you've hooked up all of your buttons and joysticks to the pins. But what pins do what? Does your controller have default button layouts? Do the defaults even match what you want? How do you know your joystick up will actually move your hero in a game of Dig Dug upwards to perform his tunnel digging duty, and not down into a Figar's open mouth? Where do we even start to configure which key presses your player 1 and 2 controls map to, let alone players 3 and 4? Your controller should, of course, come with some default documentation, but even then, why is the default player 1 fire button your left control key? If you can change it and you wanted to, where to start? Well, it's probably set to a MAME default, which is a good starting point for default keyboard to action mapping. Since most retro arcade cabinets emulate retro arcade games, it makes sense to use one of the most popular emulators as a reference configuration. MAME defines its own set of default keys for multiple players and multiple controls, and since MAME is so popular, those specific keys are the de facto standard for numerous emulators and keyboard encoders. It's an excellent starting point for mapping your physical controls, meaning your joysticks and buttons, to meaningful key presses. Once all of your mapping is complete, by way of using default pins or customization, you can begin to see how the controls, encoder, PC, and emulators work together. For example, pushing up on your joystick closes a switch, which sends a signal to the connected pin on your encoder. The encoder, in turn, sends the up arrow key press to your PC. Your PC, running your emulator, would receive the key press and ideally perform the action mapped to player 1 up. Now, keep in mind, if you want to change a mapping, you have two options. If your encoder supports reprogramming, you can change that mapping there, which is what we're going to cover later. If it doesn't, or you don't want to mess with that, you can also change your mappings in MAME, but that's at the software level. We'll cover that another time. It's probably easiest to change your mappings at the controller level though, as this way, any software you run that uses MAME defaults would, in theory, just work. But what are all of the defaults? What keys are dedicated to what actions in MAME by default? Luckily, there are quite a few places to find this information. You could scroll through the MAME menu in a game and write them down, but it's probably easier to go to a website with the default key layout, like Ultimarc, which sells keyboard encoders with their pins set to MAME defaults for you out of the box. As long as you wire all of your buttons the exact way your encoder's pins are defined, making sure that your player 1 push button maps to the P1 button pin on your encoder, for example, then you'll be all set. You could also take a look into the source code for MAME itself, which I have a link to on Christoph.io in our cheat sheet section, as well as a table copy of default Ultimarc mappings and the default MAME keys. Seek and ye shall find. It is important to note that if your control panel in any way deviates from the default of your encoder, you'll probably have to perform some customization and define your own personal mapping, which is why, after all, we're here. In my Pedestal Arcade prototype example, I'm using two encoders because I have too many buttons and joysticks for the single encoder I wanted to use, and they're definitely not going to use the defaults. So in my case, I actually use one encoder for players 1 and 3, and the other encoder for players 2 and 4. They're separated this way to make the wiring more compact and easier to manage, since players 1 and 3 are on the left side, and players 2 and 4 are on the right. If you're building a two-player cabinet, you can generally get away with just one encoder. You still may have the need to remap some buttons to perform some dedicated admin functions like exit or pause, so it's worthwhile knowledge, even if you're not building a Frankenpanel like this. It's a bit of a workshop segment from this point forward in how I went about remapping my controls to the MAME defaults. I recorded this bit to show how I proceeded with remapping to my custom specifications and pins. So while it won't necessarily apply to your customization, you can see how the utilities I used work and where I am ultimately going with my mapping. Since I'm using the Ultimarc MiniPack controllers, they already come with default pinouts that map to MAME functions. As we discussed earlier, the defaults really won't work for my setup, so I'm going to remap everything. To that end, it didn't matter what pins I plugged things into, but it is important that I kept track of the pins I did use and where, so I could map each one later. Let's go over that now. I used antiquated notebook technology to draw the pedestal button layout and assign each switch to an open pin on the bottom row of my MiniPack encoders. Since the 40 pins on the bottom row of a MiniPack have 4 dead zones and 4 ground pins, I knew I'd have 32 possible pins per encoder. As a joystick takes 4 and each button takes 1, it all starts adding up quickly. The left side contains player 1's joystick, 8 action buttons, 1 start button, and 1 insert coin button. It also contains player 3's joystick and 4 action buttons, along with start and insert coin. This side also has the 4 dedicated admin buttons for menu, pause, exit, and shift, which will be like a keyboard shift, acting as a meta button for hidden keystrokes if I want. The numbers attached to each symbol represent the pin on the MiniPack that the switch is wired on. The L and number symbols represent the LED lights, but we can ignore that for now. Since I didn't use 4 pins, I marked them at the bottom as something to disable later. The right side is very similar, except 3 buttons for dedicated mouse actions replace the admin buttons. The trackball is included since I have a LED light for it. Since I'm down 1 button on this side, an additional pin is disabled. So now I've got my mapping of controllers to pins, I need to get things set up for mapping the pins to keystrokes. This is where we're using the MAME default keys as our reference point. To complete this task, there are 3 things we need: a program to test each push of a joystick or button, a program to reprogram the encoder, and our mapping document that points us to what keystrokes a pin should represent. First, the testing program. I could have opened up Notepad and typed a bunch of things out with each keystroke and button push, but it's probably easier if I get a dedicated keyboard testing utility. Not only did I find one that suited my needs, it's actually geared towards game mapping, and it knows about MAME defaults. Excellent. The utility is free to download from GitHub, and it's part of a website dedicated to the KADE device, an arcade controller designed by retro enthusiasts with some Kickstarter backing to develop, as quoted from their website, a groundbreaking combination of hardware, firmware, and software, which comes together in one neat package for the ultimate encoder experience. Now, I don't currently own a KADE device, but the utility they offer for testing is awesome. You can get it from their GitHub page, and it's called, appropriately enough, the Keyboard Tester. The second program is quite specific to the encoders I do have, Ultimarc's MiniPAC model. Ultimarc supplies software that can detect a MiniPAC encoder and allows you to remap the pins to whatever key press you'd like. The bottom row pictured above is the exact same row I used in my mapping notebook for all my joystick and button switches. The third piece is our mapping document. I created an Excel spreadsheet for each encoder, left and right, and created columns that represent the MiniPAC's default MAME mapping. I then put columns in to represent my custom mapping, taken from my hand-drawn notebook. So these are the three parts. I use the mapping document to go from pin to pin in the Ultimarc utility, and remap each to my custom configuration, all the while testing each switch with the KADE keyboard tester. When it's all said and done, my player 1 joystick and buttons will press the default MAME keystrokes for player 1, and so on down the line until player 4 joystick and buttons are also mapped. Now we'll move on to a rough screen capture session introducing these tools and looking at some example mappings. So the first program that we'll look at here is the keyboard testing utility. This is great for testing your configuration changes in your wirings. So this utility works regardless. I don't have any keyboard encoders installed. I could just be using a keyboard and it'll tell me when I press a key, it'll show that key up here. And so just with a regular keyboard, if I hit the up key, up, and it actually says it if you want it to, so it'll say up,
down, left, right.
Up, down, left, right. And the utility is really easy to use just by being able to see the highlighted button that you've pressed and hear it. Very useful for your mapping changes. I've used the US keyboard layout because I'm in the US and not in the UK. This log you can show, this is the activity log, and you can show it or clear it, and it just kind of keeps track of what keys you've pressed. Now, I can have it say the key, or I can say no speech at all, and then there'll just be no speech, but the speech can be useful. You can have it say the key or what the main key represents. So if I say key and I hit up arrow,
up,
okay, that's up. But in MAME, that's really player 1 up. That's their joystick up. So if I hit say MAME and I hit up again on my keyboard,
P1 up,
that's player 1 up. Likewise, if I have it on say key and I hit the control button, the left control button on my keyboard, that's for primarily your fire button in MAME for player 1.
control.
So I've got L control because I'm just having it say the key right now, but if I switch it back to MAME and hit the same left control key again,
P1 button 1.
it says P1 button 1. So whichever is easier for you, if you're more comfortable with the main key mappings or just want the key. This utility will let you make sure that the key that you're pressing is how you want it. A couple things to note: if you've got it off focus and you have the say, it may not actually say anything. So now I'm typing a bunch of stuff, there's no window in focus, and it doesn't actually say the key. If I want to hear the keys, I have to have some type of window in focus. Now that may be the keyboard input tester or some other window, but once you've got a window in focus, and I've just clicked at the top here,
up, down, left, right, up.
Now the sound actually pops up. So don't feel like something's broken if you're not hearing any sound. You might just be focused on the desktop and not have any actual window in focus. So now that we've got that kind of working, let's look at the mapping document I've got. We've already seen the default MAME keys, regardless of what keyboard encoder you're using or however you're playing. By default, MAME's already got keys set up for players 1, 2, 3, and 4, and a lot of buttons set up for players 1 and 2 up to 8, and then 3 or 4 for players 3 and 4. There's also your buttons already set up for your start players and insert coins for players, as well as dedicated key commands like tab for the menu or escape to exit the game. So we've already gone over that. Now what I've done is I've put Ultimarc's mappings into a spreadsheet. So all of the pins on my MINIPAC encoder are already set by default to a lot of MAME stuff. You would just have to make sure that you use the proper pin and make sure you use the exact same pin for all your wirings. So I must make sure that my joystick up, which is player 1 up, so that's this one, I'd have to make sure that joystick up is wired to pin 39 on my MINIPAC. And in this case it is, but it's not always that way. If you've got more controls, or you don't have just player 1 and player 2, and you've got multiple players, you might have to change your config settings, and that's why we're here. If you're wiring all the way to the defaults and you're only using the default buttons, then you can just use the defaults. You don't have to do any of this. It's still not a bad idea to test these things out to make sure they work with this keyboard input tester, but you don't have to do these mapping changes. But by default, what we've got for Ultimarc is they've got a bunch of logical pins already set up for player 2 and 1, and some for player 3s and 4s, depending on the Ultimarc board you have. But I've also got the MAME default next to it. So I took the table from Ultimarc and I imported it into Excel. And by default, these pins on the MINIPAC will perform these key presses, which usually map to some type of logical action. So player 1 joystick up, down, left, and right are usually the down, left, right arrows and up arrows on your keyboard. And if you hook your joystick up to those exact pins, then it'll just work right out of the box. And in my case they do, because if I hit my joystick up, down, left, and right, we'll hear the keyboard input tester actually say it, and you'll see the cursor move around in my Excel spreadsheet.
Down, left, right, up, down, down, right, left, up.
And that's using the joystick, not my actual keypad. So by default, they've got these setups for 8 buttons for player 1 and 8 buttons for player 2, and the joystick directions, and then insert coin and start for player 1 and 2. But unfortunately, I have too many buttons on my control panel and too many dedicated buttons. I've got dedicated buttons for menu and pause and exit. I've also got players 3 and 4, and my MINIPAC just doesn't have enough room. The MINIPAC pins only go so far. If I sort by the MINIPAC pin number, it stops at 40 here, and there's still a bunch of player 3 and 4 stuff. So for a default MINIPAC setting, it's not going to work for me. And if you're only doing a 2-player setup, maybe it'll work for you, but in a 4-player setup, I actually have 2 MINIPACs connected. So I'll have to work on encoding for the left MINIPAC, which covers players 1 and 3, and then I'll have to work on the encoding for the second MINIPAC, which covers players 2 and 4. So they're basically my MINIPAC left and my MINIPAC right, respectively. So I've got this other spreadsheet set up with the same type of logical MAME defaults and MINIPACs. This hasn't changed. This is just for my reference. But then I've got them mapped to my logical. So I kept track when I put these buttons and joysticks and all the controls into my prototype board. I kept track of which pins went to what button or joystick action. And that's basically what I've now got a map to on this end. So I knew that I mapped, for example, I knew I mapped pin 19 to my joystick down. Well, it's already set that way by default, because I haven't changed any of my encoder settings. You already saw.
Right, up, left.
It's already working as the cursor keys, so that's fine. However, I did not go directly by the book in terms of these button mappings, because I knew they'd be different. With a player 1 and 3, I'm not going to be using the player 2 mappings. I want to use the player 3 mappings instead. And by default, those MAME default keys, which we saw earlier and from the MAME website, they're just not the same as player 2 up and down, left, right, and action buttons. So we have to disable some of these and remap them to our own. And you can see I'm using the pin that on the MINIPAC would normally be for second player down. For me is player 3 up, and second left is actually player 3 right. This does not matter so much because I kept track of all my mappings, but it's just to show you that it's not going to be the same. I don't have a real quote-unquote player 2 on the left MINIPAC. So what to do? You've got your Ultimarc logicals and your MAME defaults, and if you're just wiring doesn't make an exact match, how do you reconfigure it? How do I reconfigure it so that the pause button I've got right now, which is MINIPAC pin 3, by default it's enter, but I want it to be pause. I want that button, when I hit it, to push P as a keyboard button. So if I do it now,
enter, enter, enter.
It's enter and it's not pause. I need it to be pause. So what I really want it to do is to be P. How do we handle that? Well, Ultimarc and a lot of other encoders will usually have some type of utility to help you map that. And this is the IPAC utility for that mapping. So it knows I've got a mini-pack connected. And by the way, I've only got one of the mini-pack connected. If I had both, this doesn't let me choose which device. So it's pretty important that if you are going to use multiple encoders, that you only connect one at a time when you're doing your configuration changes. Otherwise, you don't know which one you're talking to. So I've got my right mini-pack disconnected right now, and it's just the left. It gives you a great little visual representation of the mappings of the mini-pack. This is considered pin 1. This is all the way through pin 20. This is what I've just marked down personally as 21, and then all the way through 40. And I kept track of my individual pin outwork here, as opposed to what the defaults are, because I knew I'd be changing everything anyway. The pins at top represent the mouse buttons, and the are really more the connectors for your spin track and your aim track, or your spin track and your U track, your trackball and your spinners. So we're not going to worry about those. I'm really going to worry about these. So these are hard-coded, this list of pins here. These are the same Ultimarc logicals we have here, are these pins here, and they're hard-coded. I don't change this. This just helps identify which pin is selected out here. So I can either select it via this list, or I can use my mouse and select the pin. So for example, if I look at pin 19 on the mini-pack, that should be one down. That should be the down arrow on a keyboard. So if I go to one down here, there it is. Since we know this is 20, this is 19, it automatically highlights it for you. So this is really nothing more than just to select which one you're pressing. See, if I click whichever one, it changes this up here. That's it. There's nothing else for these. You can enter a nickname if I want. I could type, well, if I want this to be player 2 up and I want it to be something else, I can type a nickname. That nickname is just stored locally. It doesn't mean anything to the board. So let's go for that. Let's go remap our pause button. Since the Ultimarc logical of 1B, which is this pin here, physically this is mapped to the button I want to have, this pause. And for pause in MAME is P. I want it to be P, but we already knew that was enter, because if I hit that pause button in Excel here,
enter, enter, enter.
Well, it's hitting enter. I want it to be P. So since I've already found that 1B is enter, and I'm on pin 1B and enter, so that's matching, and these should all match. These two columns should match that. I want it to be pause, because that's my logical function for it, and I've chosen P because that is the MAME default. I'm just overriding this pin. Well, I'm going to say, okay, 1B, I'm going to hit my primary drop down, and it'll show me the options for which keys I want it to map to. So right now it maps to enter. I'm going to change that to P. It'll say board successfully reconfigured if everything worked out okay. And now, if I go, for example, into Excel, or if I highlight over my keyboard input tester, I'm going to hit that same pause button again, and instead of enter,
P, 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 P.
You can see the keyboard input tester is showing P, and in Excel I've typed a bunch of keys and now deleted them. And so now that mapping is done. And if I select away from it and I select back on 1B, instead of enter, it's still P. So a real easy way to map these things. And I don't have to do this every time. This writes it into the IPAC's configuration. So there's nothing on the actual computer on my PC itself that stores this configuration. So if I go to some other machine and I hook the IPAC up, it's going to have my configuration embedded inside of it. So what I need to do then for the left mini pack is go through each of the pins and one by one make sure, and I'm just sorting by pin number, I would start at 2 and work my way down and make sure that all the pins are the way they should be. And then I have to do that for my right pedestal. And you can see that it's these same columns here, except I'm just overriding what my logical control is going to be. Since I've got 8 buttons for player 1 and 2, I'm just using them here as well, but I've I've changed the mappings. I don't have a player 1 on my right pedestal MiniPAC. I have players 2 and 4, so I had to override them somewhere. So I've got players 2 mapped here, and I've got players 4 with only 4 buttons mapped here, and then some mouse buttons. So this is the end-all be-all of the mapping. These columns here match to what I wrote down when I was hooking up buttons in my little notebook. These columns with the Ultimarc logical MAME default MiniPAC pin are what you get out of the box with the iPAC. So once again, if you're using defaults, you don't have to go into this utility. I think it's still cool, and it's really useful to have the keyboard input tester just to make sure you're doing the right thing, but you don't have to do it. It is a one-time setup, but it's something that's kind of necessary. If you've got another encoder, they probably have some type of configuration, but if they don't, then you just have to be very careful when you're plugging in your wires that your buttons always map to the encoder's wire configuration. One of the things that I wanted to cover, I'm not necessarily going to use this functionality for my arcade, but I did want to note that there's one of the pins here, you can see I'll click off of it, one of the pins has a slight shading here. And by default, this is for your 1 button on your keyboard, and by MAME's default, this is to start player 1 in a game. So you've inserted, you hit your coin key and you want to start your game, you hit 1 and that's player 1 start. By default, Ultimarc has got this as a shift button. And what that means is that just like your shift on your keyboard, if you're holding this down and you hit any of the other keys or buttons, it can be a completely different mapping. So just like if I hit A, it's a lowercase a, and I hit shift, it's now an uppercase A. They're 2 distinct buttons. This can be very useful if you have an arcade panel configuration with a lot less buttons than my Franken panel. So maybe I don't have a dedicated escape button and I just want to be able to say, well, if I just hit both start buttons for players 1 and 2 at the same time, I exit out. Well, you can do that in this example because player 1 start is the shift button, and when you've got a shift button defined, usually you have your primary or shifted values be the same. So if I hit the shift button now,
1, 1, 1.
That's player 1 start on MAME. I would say the MAME for this. I'll hit it again.
P1 start, P1 start.
Right, and I've got my player 1 start button defined. Now if I go over by Ultimarc's defaults, they've already set some shifting up by default. So in MAME you hit escape to exit your game. How do I do that here if I don't have anything wired to 2B? So maybe I want to use their defaulted shift. So what this means is that if I hold down start 1, which is my shifter button, and I press the start 2 button, instead of 2, it'll actually hit escape. So if I hit start 2 right now, by default, it'll be 2.
P2 start, P2 start, P2 start.
Okay, that's player 2 start. That's the standard number 2 on your keyboard. But if I hold down player 1 start first, and if I don't release it, it'll actually, and then I hit P start 2, we'll actually get escape.
Cancel/exit game.
So that was holding down both player 1, holding down my shifter, which is player 1 start, and then hitting the player 2 button.
Cancel/exit game.
It actually sends escape instead of P2 start. So what this also means is that your shifter button, for example, doesn't register until you let go of the button, since it's a special shifter button now. If I just press P2 start alone and hold it down, it's automatically already registered by the keyboard input tester. It sends that key.
P2 start.
Now I'll let go. So it already did it. The shifter button, on the other hand, which is already player 1, so if I hit player 1 start, it won't actually say anything. It won't send the keystroke until I let go of the button. So I've got it down, nothing's been said. If I let it up,
P1 start.
now it actually says it. So your shifter doesn't register the default value of 1 here until I let go, because it could be used for shifting. I don't want a shift button to register until I've either pressed a button alone or let go of shift. So that's kind of how shift functionality plays with the Ultimarc encoders, and once again the idea is that if you're limited in your buttons, or you just want to be able to make them quick and you don't want to have a a panel with all these buttons everywhere, you can use the shift function to get other buttons to play instead with all the controls that you currently have wired. As I guess is another example, by default, if I hold the down button on my joystick,
P1 down, P1 down.
That's of course going to move my cursor down because the main default for player 1 down is the down cursor. But if I do that while I hold my shift button, which is P1 start, so if I hold down P1 start, and what'll happen, what I'm expecting to have happen, is the P button has pause. So if I did that, I hold down player 1 start and hold down on my joystick.
Pause the game.
Instead of P1 down,
P1 down.
I got pause.
Pause the game. Pause the game.
That's what the shift button allows you to do. Temporarily, while you hold that button down and press any of your other buttons, you can use a completely different keyboard value. Just like your regular shift buttons are when you're typing on your keyboard between lower and uppercase, they're two completely different keys. That's what the WinIPAC shifting utility gets you. So let's recap this video and finish it before I figure out something else to add. We first looked at the function of an arcade controller and what it does as it's integrated between your arcade controls and your retro gaming PC. We looked at a few sample encoders and discussed the option of hacking your own. We then discussed what MAME default keys are and why they're a good starting point. We then got into my head and looked at how I wired up my pedestal build and mapped each joystick and button to a unique pin on my encoders. We then took that mapping and programmed each pin to a MAME default key press using the Ultimarc mapping utility, and then tested all along the way with the keyboard tester from KADE. Right, wrong, or indifferent, I told myself I'd document my pedestal project, and you've just finished another video along the way. Hopefully it helps you in your custom arcade cabinet build. Until next time, I'm Eric R. Christoph, signing off.